Hello gamers, Powered Heel here, and today we're going to talk about Naxx, and we're going to answer the simple question, is it hard? And if so, why it's hard? And I'm being a bit facetious there because I think it's not really that much of a simple question, and it's something that always gets brought up every time Naxx releases for vanilla. Did in the original version, it did in SOM, and it did now. I think Season of Discovery was a bit different because just there was so much changed about Season of Discovery, so that's going to be a bit of an outlier. But anytime, Naxx gets talked about from the original vanilla version of the game, it's a fiercely debated topic. And I'll just kind of get right into things and state my thoughts first, and then we'll elaborate as we typically do. So I think it is pretty hard in a relative sense for the game. Now, the caveat that we're going to mention before anything else is that it's hard for classic WoW, okay? So in no way am I trying to say that this is comparable to any level of like retail content or anything like that whatsoever. Just get that out of the way. It's not even close, right? On top of that, I would say even other versions of content like the Burning Crusade, or I would say at least Wrath of the Lich King, has some harder fights. Burning Crusade has harder fights as well, I would say. Although I think some of the fights that people talk about in Burning Crusade that they would maybe consider harder than some Naxx fights aren't necessarily as hard as some Naxx fights in an overall sense when you factor in like how hard it is to kind of get everybody together and stuff like that. But, for the most part, I'm willing to say that Burning Crusade was a step up in difficulty from vanilla PvE-wise. So if that's the case, then why am I saying Naxx is hard, right? And I think Naxx is a great example of how tuning can really change the perception of content. And I think that that's amplified by it having an analog of basically it's like the same raid recreated in Wrath of the Lich King, the 25-man version, right? And you can basically see how this raid would be when it's tuned lighter, essentially, right? Like, because we have that in Lich King now. It's changed on a fundamental level to some degree, right? Some things are just outright changed. But for the most part, a lot of the mechanics and the abilities are very similar. It's just that everything kind of does less damage. And now, obviously, it does more absolute damage in 25-man Naxx, right? Because in 25-man Naxx, your health pool's higher, you do more damage. So mobs have more health in 25-man Naxx, and they deal more damage to you technically. But in terms of, in a relative sense, a percentage of your health, things in 40-man Naxx just hit way harder. And this is something that I think people don't understand if they've only done the 25 Naxx, or if they haven't done Naxx at all, and they're just hearing about Naxx from people who've done vanilla, and they're confused how anything can be hard. I actually just talked to somebody last night, a friend of mine, and I was kind of ranting to him about how, Naxx is going to be like a nightmare in, these anniversary servers, because I think the quality of the player base is kind of worse than it was in other versions of the game. That's something we can kind of get into in another video, but and that, that paired with the difficulty of Naxx is kind of like a recipe for disaster in terms of how many people are actually going to clear it. And he just wouldn't hear it. He's like, you're delusional. Like, how could you? He is a retail player. Like, he only plays retail. And he's like, like, you play retail and stuff like that, so how could you even say that Naxx is hard? That's completely ridiculous. The content's so brain dead. It's the exact same thing as Wrath of the Lich King. And it's really just not because of the tuning. And the tuning is going to be like the overarching thing in this video that kind of, it creeps into every aspect of why it's difficult, I would say. And it's kind of like subtle if you haven't done Naxx, but it's not that subtle once you step into Naxx. And to kind of highlight this, I'm going to talk a little bit about just how different it felt to do for me on 25-man in Lich King versus on 40-man. And I think I actually have a relatively good perspective because in 25-man Naxx, I played a rogue, and I did the Fan of Knives abuse, where I, had a combat swap where you basically hit Blade Flurry and just do a ton of Fan of Knives AoE damage to everything on the screen. And in 40 Nax, I played a healer, right? Played multiple healers through it. So I have a pretty good perspective, I think, on what makes them different in terms of the tuning. And let me just say that in 40 Nax or 25 Nax, you can almost W key through all the trash. Now, a lot of the trash mechanics are the same, but the damage they do to you is so far reduced in a sense of your percentage of your overall health that you can make way more mistakes and just kind of go through the raid. People have no idea what the trash even does on 25-man Nax, and part of that is because you don't take as much damage, right? Part of that is also because it's easier to heal the damage because there's less people taking damage, right? And you have more powerful spells that do more AoE healing. And then another factor in that is just that you do so much damage in Wrath of the Lich King that the trash actually dies much quicker. So I'd say when you combine those three things from a damage perspective, right, you get a real easy idea of why things are so different. And it's funny because I remember W keying through pretty much all of 25-man Nax on my rogue, just obliterating everything with Fan of Knives. And then in the Death Knight wing on 25-man, you can actually kind of get humbled there even on 25-man Nax, right? Because if you do big enough pulls, and I had evasion up and everything on my rogue, but I was a little bit lazy with where I was standing at times, thinking okay, I basically can't die here. I have evasion. I'm in 25-man Nax. I'm geared. You can actually die on some of that trash. So if you can die there, just think about how hard it can be to survive some of these pulls as a melee in actual Nax 40, right, where things legitimately hit hard. So that's kind of the first thing, is just playing through them, you get a real sense of how different the damage is. And healing 40-man Nax, you can just see the damage that goes out. It's absolutely crazy, and it's kind of in a lot of ways. It's in the AoE damage that sometimes goes out, and then the spike damage on individual players. Now, a lot of times this is the result of multiple overlapping cleaves and things of that sort. But regardless, you can just feel how crazy the damage is when you heal it on 40-man. And it's a huge, huge problem because what it does is it basically causes deaths, right? And in vanilla WoW, in the 40 Nax, those deaths are way more impactful than they're going to be in 25-man because you have world buffs in 40-man. Now, you're not going to have world buffs out for every trash pack necessarily, and it's very common to, do trash without buffs, get to a boss, unboon, do a series of bosses, and then maybe reboon or something. But then if you go to unboon after that, right, you're stuck until you can reboon again, which is probably at least 30 minutes or so. So you're going to be doing some portion of the raid as trash, unbuffed. And let me tell you, basically everything in Nax, trash-wise, has a chance to kill you, okay? If you don't handle the gargoyles right after Noth, you can die there. If you don't handle the slimes properly going into patchwork, very easy to die there. If you don't handle the A-bombs correctly in that section, very easy to die. If you do not handle the A-bombs going into Grobula section, very easy for people to die. The Spider Wing, even though it's notoriously one of the easier wings, the beginning packs of the spiders can be very easy to die if you don't handle the charge correctly, okay? Even doing some of the, what I would say have become the meta strategies, quote-unquote, lip taunting things in that section. Nothing's hard or complex about a lip taunt, right? But the problem is that if somebody misses the taunt, or if they don't lip, or if they, there's just confusion about who's doing the taunt, people can die there easily. Either the person that didn't lip will die if they taunted and didn't lip, or the, somebody else who opened early before the taunt went out will die. There's so many ways you can die on that trash. The Death Knight trash hits very hard does a ton of damage. So there's just tons of ways you can die on that trash and lose your buffs, and for every buff you lose, you can't replace it easily. This isn't SOD where you can just go get new buffs. You'd have to like completely go out of the raid and sit in a town, and especially at this version of this where we are in the game's life cycle, there's not tons of buffs going out all the time anymore. I wouldn't say that they're super scarce, and in some ways there's been a resurgence as Naxx has come back out, but they're not super common anymore. So yeah, you're not really going out of the raid, rebuffing, and coming back in unless you're doing it as an entire raid, right? Like if 10, 15 of your raiders died and lost buffs, they're most likely buffless for the rest of that run tonight until you go back in the next time, or unless you as a group decide to exit out and completely rebuff for a particular boss. And not having those buffs is a big deal, because this raid was essentially made to be like the pinnacle of difficulty for vanilla. It was supposed to be hard. It was supposed to be something you were going to have to prog. And that's reflected not only in the damage output, but in kind of like the HP values that the mobs have. And world buffs really help to cut through that kind of buffer that they gave these bosses to make them a bit difficult, to make the fights last longer. So if you actually don't have world buffs, or if you're losing a substantial amount of buffs due to trash, then those encounters that have, quite a bit of HP for vanilla standards become much, much more difficult. And now the encounters even pose more of a threat, right? Because the encounter is going for longer. You have to deal with the mechanics for longer. You have to deal with the hard-hitting boss for longer. So there's just more opportunities for more people to make mistakes, for even more people to lose buffs. And it can quickly become this kind of cascading situation where, you lose 5 buffs or something on, the Spider Wing trash, or even, like, let's say the Death Knight Wing trash. Now that's affecting you for the rest of the raid, and it's causing more people to die, because not only do they have less damage to kill things quicker, make things safer, but they have less HP themselves. So not only are they potentially repeat dying, but they are actually getting more heals, probably, as a relative percentage of heals going out. Because if you have a warrior that's at 6k HP, because he lost his buffs, versus one that's at 8 or 9k HP, your eyes are going to be more attracted to the one who's at 6k HP, because he's going to be lower most of the time. Which means that you're now not healing the people with buffs as much, which makes it easier for them to die. So you can really see how the cascading effect kind of plays in. And the way I like to describe Naxx's difficulty, honestly, is kind of like death by 1,000 cuts is perfect. It's cliche, but it's true. And there's also some hard barriers as well, some kind of like wall bosses, depending on what your raid might be struggling with. But it really is all those little deaths that kind of add up. And not only are you losing world buffs, but you're losing consumes. And the idea is for the average guild, like, you're not necessarily reconsuming to full every time that you die. And I've been in these runs. I've been in AQ pugs, even, right, where you die a lot less than in an Naxx pug. And even in an AQ pug, where of a pretty good pug, I would say, people don't necessarily, like, repop their mongoose. They don't repop their firewater, stuff like that after a wipe. And this is a huge problem in Naxx, because you're going to be wiping a lot more. And it's way easier to get to that point where it's just like, I can't afford it, man. I can't repop all these consumes, right? So you end up just doing the trash with even less buffs. So it just makes things even worse, right? So trash, huge problem right off the bat. The fact that it's more difficult just has an impact on the entire raid, I would say. The second thing I would talk about is that it's harder to hide bad players in Naxx. And this has something to do with the player count, right? So obviously, when we compare 40 Naxx to 25 Naxx, some people naively, like my friend I was talking to last night, I mentioned, he's just thinking, well, it's just scaled up for like more players, right? So they basically took the 25-man Naxx, they scaled the HP for 40 players, and to take into account the gear that you would have in Lich King, or they not that they scaled the HP up, sorry, in 40 Naxx because it came after, but he was saying that they scaled the 40 Naxx HP down and then adjusted and gave more HP depending on the gear level. And as we already determined, that's not the case, right? Because things just hit harder in a relative sense. But on top of that, 40 Nax was a vanilla raid that is more designed than any other raid to actually make use of all 40 players in your raid. Because there's this common thought process that people like my friend have where they think, most vanilla raids are basically designed for like 25 people to carry the 40 through. And I'd say that's kind of the case with Molten Core and Blackwing Lair. It becomes a little bit more different, or a little bit different when you get to something like AQ40. And then when you get to Nax, I would say you kind of really need most people to be paying attention. Like, obviously not everybody you bring is going to be an all-star player, but if you have 15 players in your raid in 40 Nax that have no idea what's going on, it's probably going to cause a problem. You'd have to get very, very lucky for it not to. And the reason is because there's just more personal responsibility put on individual players in 40-man Nax. And what that means is it's harder to hide your weaker players because they're going to get exposed just by the sheer volume of mechanics that's thrown at the entire raid. Also, they're quite dispersed throughout the entire raid. So, for example, if you have really bad DPS and great healers, you'll still feel that on fights like Saffron and fights like Patchwork that are normally thought to be somewhat healing-centric fights, right? Because really they're a DPS and healing check, right? If you don't do enough DPS, you will go And if you don't do enough healing, you will die. So both of those can be walls in different ways. So no matter what, like if your DPS core is strong but your healers are weak, you'll struggle in some areas. And if your healers are weak but your DPS cores are strong, you'll struggle in other areas, potentially sometimes on the same boss, like I just said. Tanking, also another huge issue in Nax, right? Because it's just very important that your tanks understand threat, understand how to get, in the higher threat table of a boss. And keep in mind that Nax tends to use more tanks than most other raids for quite a few fights. Four Horsemen is the one that's always brought up, right? But not even necessarily that, especially with some modern strategies. Just other fights as well, like Patchwork use more tanks. Some of the trash requires a lot of pseudo tanks. So if you have players that are just super unfamiliar with tanking, have never tanked before, and you're suddenly thrusting them into these roles where the stakes are incredibly high and the mobs do an insane amount of damage and are very deadly and have very nasty effects that have to be dealt with properly, then you're gonna run into a ton of trouble there. So in this particular raid, I would say more than any other raid, the fact that you have 40 people is sort of a detriment, right? You want to have the 25 people from Lich King because it's just way easier to control who gets into your raid and command them, right? It's pretty common sense. So something that's normally considered to be like a boon that you have, like, the idea is you have 40 players and only 25 of them need to be good, right? So it's easy to find like 25 players that can kind of carry the rest. And it's like, no, you would rather just have 25 solid players in a 25 player raid. And when you kind of need close to 40 players all putting out something that resembles a decent performance, that's where you end up with a problem when you have a 40 player requirement. So there's that. And the other thing I would say is Nax is kind of the first raid in vanilla that has like really, really novel fights. I guess like AQ actually has some pretty novel fights, but Nax does it more often and the consequences are more severe. So I'll compare something like Visk, right? Visk is a pretty novel fight from AQ40, but the reality is that, only certain people on that fight really need to know what's going on. Okay, so even though the fight itself is kind of novel, it's more about going out and doing the hard farming things, right? It's about going out, getting your frost weapons, bringing frost oils every week, bringing cleansing potions, protection potions. And if you kind of do all that, it'll turn out okay for the most part, as long as some people in your raid at the top know what needs to go on in terms of macro level strategy. If you bring your sappers, even the sappering portion of the fight is relatively easy, right? And even if you don't have people that are landing perfect sappers, if you get another phase, it's most of the time not the end of the world, even for a mediocre guild. But in Nax, it's quite a bit different because, just look at something like Vesuvius, right? it's a very specific job for priests. They've probably never used the mind control ability before, right? Like, if they've never used mind control before and you get to Vesuvius, you could be in trouble just from the fact that they don't even know how, like, what button their mind control things are bound to, right? And maybe their bar isn't even on screen. Maybe they hit it or something like that, right? Like, you can run into basic problems like that, and that's not even counting how the boss is kind of weird because it does the shout, which has a really large range. So if you're not tanking in the right spot, the mind control will break, right? And then people won't be able to read mind control for a little bit because they're silenced. So it's really a case where it tests specific groups of players that might not normally have ever been tested in other runs. So if you've been, kind of had a couple priests in your raid that don't really know what's going on, but they press the healing buttons enough on the tank for things to be successful, and then you throw a fight in like this that's just asking them to do something completely different, yeah, you might wipe quite a few times on Vesuvius. And guess what? If you happen to have buffs out before that fight, then now they're all gone, right? And yeah, most of the time you're going to be able to try and control for these scenarios, right? For example, if you're doing Vesuvius with inexperienced priests, you're probably not going to have your buffs out for that fight. But at some point, you're going to hit a fight where you're going to have to have had your buffs out, right? Either to down the fight itself, or because, you just can't reboon and you're not going to wait 30 minutes to reboon, essentially, is going to be the idea for most guilds, right? Patchwork, another fight like this, where it can be a little weird sometimes, right? Because, people are just not used to healing how you would heal the Patchwork Hateful Strikes. And especially for guilds not that great, if, you don't have very good DPS, the fight's going to last a bit, then it becomes very important to heal that fight efficiently. And if you have people that are just tossing random heals out, and you're kind of keeping the tanks alive, but, you're just doing it by bombing them with a heal, you're not being strategic about it at all, if you don't have good DPS, your guild might be wiping it like 30 to 40% due to the healers just going oom. So that's kind of something we've never seen before. The low Theb mechanic, that's very, very unique, right? Very, very weird, and that's going to take a bit of coordination. And if you just go into that blind, that's not going to be good for anybody. So there's basically tons of these fights that have kind of really unique. Heigen, another one, right? Super unique. Just really, really unique mechanics that they really do go well beyond tank and spank in most cases. That even fights in AQ, even when they are technically there's more to them than tank and spank, for a majority of the players, they still function as tank and spank. To give kind of another example of that from AQ, something like Cthulhu it looks a lot different than a normal, traditional vanilla WoW fight. But in reality, most people are they're just doing damage to something throughout the entire fight, and they're just being told to stand in like one spot. They're basically, their spots are fixed on the map, right? And then even when they have to rotate, they just, in most cases, rotate back to the same spot. So even a fight like Cthulhu that seems to have a lot of like weird mechanics in it, you can safe strat it relatively easily, right? Whereas on Naxx, there's really no safe stratting, like Vesuvius. Like, you just have to have the priest get in there and experience it, and they're probably going to fail a couple times. It's kind of the same with the dance, right? The dance is a little bit different because, you'll probably have somebody who has experience and has led it. So if you have people stay on that person, it helps. But if those people had to do the dance individually by themselves, it would just take them time to learn, like which sections of the floor to avoid and stuff like that. Like, they would get hit. They'd overrun to the next section because they wouldn't realize where it is. They'd take extra damage, things of that nature. So Naxx is just kind of like a different beast in terms of some of the things the fights make you do. And then the last thing I have here is that the most intensive gear fights, quote unquote, kind of come later in the instance. And now this makes logical sense, right? Because the idea initially when this came out is that you're going to be progressing it for multiple weeks. You're going to be accumulating gear. Then you'll have the gear to kind of go into the better fights. But obviously there's this expectation that's kind of come out ever since, I would say the 2019 vanilla, where you basically go in and one-shot content immediately, because that's how a lot of the earlier raids were done. And the problem with doing this in Naxx is when you talk about the death by 1,000 cuts that I was mentioning earlier, where you just take little bits of damage from all these things, the trash, the unique bosses, not having world buffs from dying in these places and stuff like that. By the time you actually get to the last fights, Saffron and Kel'Thuzad, those are the fights where you need buffs the most, and you kind of don't have them. That's why you see so many guilds actually going back out or rebuffing for Saf, actually. This is a thing that definitely happened in Classic 2019. So you basically need the buffs at that point, and they tend not to be there for you, and that makes it even harder. And even if you go and you rebuff for something like Saf, if you're not a guild that has experience killing Saf, and you've basically rebuffed to kill Saf, and you barely do get him down, you probably lost a lot of buffs on Saf, so now you don't have buffs for KT, right? And until you really get these fights down, this can go on for multiple weeks. So basically, by the time you get to these pinnacle fights, you're already so beaten and banged up that it can be hard to get across the finish line. You also have the least amount of consumes, right? Like I said, you've been dying throughout the whole fight, and now people are like, well, we really need you to pop that mongoose for Saf. We didn't care you didn't have it on during the other trash, but we really need you to put it on for Saf. But it's like, yeah, but I just don't have it, Or let's say you do have it, maybe you even have 2 or 3. You wipe 2 or 3 times on Saf, now you don't have any for KT. So it's all these little things that kind of accumulate together and contribute to making the instance just really, really difficult. And I also just want to give an honorable mention to unique fights of 4 Horsemen, because I don't know how that didn't immediately come to mind when I was talking about unique fights. But that's another one where, especially if you're unable to do like the burn strategy, if you don't have the damage for that, it's going to probably take a few times, to just kind of get that down. It's not a difficult fight, but it's very possible to lose people just to them not understanding where they need to be, and then that kind of cascades, makes the rest of the fight more difficult. And if you can't get some horsemen down very quickly to balance out the number of people you've lost, then you are in for a lot of trouble on that fight, right? So yeah, that's basically a lot of my thoughts as to why this raid is difficult. And I'd say the final point is just kind of like the time progression that people are willing to put into the raid, and that kind of like the raid requires. And as we've already noted, things like the trash, the lack of world buffs due to dying to the trash. So there's the trash itself, just being a lot of it. There's the trash being harder, which makes it slower. There's the fact that it kills your world buffs, which makes the whole raid slower overall. Then there's the idea of potentially wiping to bosses because you don't have as many world buffs, okay? Then there's the idea of potentially wiping to bosses just because they're hard, in some cases like Saffron, or just because they're novel and new, and you haven't encountered them before, like 4 Horsemen or Vesuvius. And then you encounter then we talk about the lack of consumes, right? Where you're going to be doing some portion of this maybe without consumes towards the end because you ran out, or just limited consumes in some areas like the trash. All this stuff ultimately contributes to more time being lost in the raid. And a lot of guilds in Classic basically get to Naxx by doing 1 raid night a week. Okay, and it's usually not a very, long raid night. It's usually probably like 2 hours max. Like, there's people in Anniversary that I played with where they're tapped out doing a 2-hour AQ, right? Like, that's a demon run, and they just, at that point, they're mentally checked out. So you can imagine if doing a 2-hour AQ, like an AQ that went bad is like a demon run for AQ, if that's super mentally exhausting, then what is it going to be like to be in Naxx for 4 hours and to potentially wipe and not even clear the instance, not even get to your soft reserve or get to the item that you want, essentially, that you need. And a lot of guilds will add an extra day or try to add an extra day, but, how successful that is varies because they basically haven't done this for the entire duration of the game's life cycle, and then they try and add another day. Some people can't make that day. you have to end up recruiting new people. You might lose people because now it's like, oh, we don't want to, we can't make the second day, and I'm basically losing out on loot doing it that day. So it creates all sorts of issues like that as well. Most of these guilds that are in vanilla WoW are not like retail mythic progression guilds where, at one point in Mists of Pandaria, when that was like retail at the time, I was in a 3 hour per night, 3 days a week guild clearing Throne of Thunder. And we actually got like US 25th or 26th in that guild, which is like incredible because most guilds at that point were, at least if they were going to raid 3 nights a week, they're at least doing 4 hours, which doesn't necessarily sound like it's a lot different, but it honestly can be in a progression environment. Having an entire extra hour every night is pretty huge. And then on top of that, a lot of the guilds that were kind of like competing at our level were doing 5 days a week, 4 hours a night, or at least 5 days a week, 3 hours a night, something like that. So that was commonplace back then. And if you're in like a retail guild really trying to push and progress through content, it's sort of what you need to invest into. You need to do those like at least 3 nights a week, 3 to 4 hours a night, because if you don't, the bosses are just so hard and they take so many reps, right, to just do that. You're not going to get them down in any reasonable amount of time, rating like 1 day a week for 2 hours a night in retail. And obviously Classic is not anywhere close to retail, but if you can't add at least 1 more day to the roster, that's going to make Naxx really, really hard for you, right? Having 1 additional day goes a long way. So if you guys are struggling, if your guild can get 1 more day in, I would say that's pretty ideal. Basically gives you like double the time for most guilds. And just having 2 days in that raid will really help ease the burden. But again, it's getting people, do they want to come back to that second day, especially when there's wipes involved in both days, right? If it's not going to be super clean. So it's just kind of like the expectation level is the last thing I would say, that people expect to kind of go in and just full clear because they've done that for all the other raids. They expect it to be a 1 to 2 hour raid at max, more closer to the 1 hour side. And it's just not going to be the case if you're not super experienced, super buffed, super geared. If you're just a dad guild that doesn't have that much experience, it's probably going to be a 2-night clear. It's probably going to be 4 hours per night, and there's probably going to be a lot of gold spent and consumed. There might be time rebuffing, so it's going to be an investment. And that's basically why I think Naxx is hard. So it mostly comes down to the difference in expectation level for that version of the game for Classic versus something like retail. Obviously, it's not hard in an absolute sense, right? If you brought the Mythic Raiders in from Liquid. Ironically, they would wipe a lot if you didn't tell them what to do in Naxx, but they wouldn't struggle to clear it because they would adapt very quickly and kill the bosses, right? But they would wipe a lot in the sense that they'd be missing certain things, if nobody was there to kind of guide them and tell them what was going on. Because the reality is the mechanics are, even though they're simple, they're very punishing, right? Like, something I was actually thinking about before I made this video, where I don't know if I want to include it, but I figure I'll just include it here at the end, is it may be reasonable to say that some of the bosses in Naxx are sort of harder than like a first mythic retail boss even, because just the way the first boss is almost designed typically in like mythic raiding is it's meant to be a give me in most raids. And the mechanics are very intuitive, very kind of easy to figure out. And even if you bypass some of the mechanics, a lot of the times first raid bosses don't have like instant wipe mechanics. So in some ways, it could be seen as potentially being easier than some of the Naxx bosses, right? Because a lot of the Naxx bosses just have like if you don't do this exactly this way, like you will just wipe. So until you figure that out, like you will wipe basically. And I think mechanically, even the first fight in retail probably harder, like in terms of movement and things of that nature. But just in terms of like how punishing a fight is relative to its version of the game, the first fight in a mythic raid tier might actually be easier. In that particular sense, not saying overall, but people who know. So that's basically my thoughts. If you're struggling, just keep plugging away, keep trying to recruit, and hopefully you'll get there eventually. But if you need any tips or anything like that, I have a bunch of guides out on the channel for how to heal it, because that's basically what this channel is, a healer's perspective. And I will talk to you guys next time. So see you later.